Welcome to the Bradford seminar, sponsored by the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. I'm Michael Oppenheimer, director of the center. Our speaker today is Leah Stokes, assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and also affiliated with the Brent School and the Environmental Studies Department at UCSB. Dr. Stokes received her PhD in public policy from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT in 2015. And since then, she has established herself as a leading scholar in the domain of the politics of public policy toward energy and the environment. I highly recommend her recently published book, Short Circuiting Policy, Interest Groups and the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States, published by Oxford University Press, which examines electric utilities, climate denial, and the opposition to state-level clean energy legislation. At a time when there is a critical need to understand the role of government at all levels in the necessary transformation of our energy system to avert a dangerous level of climate change, Leah's research is at the cutting edge. The subject of Leah's talk today is short-circuiting policy challenges to the U.S. clean energy laws. Please join me in welcoming Leah Stokes.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Michael, for that kind introduction. And I think the title will have to be Challenges and Opportunities, because we have really good opportunities this year. And I'm going to be excited to talk about a bunch about that today. So just sharing my slides. I'm sure you can all see them. The other day I was giving a talk at Google, which was sort of fun, but then I had to use Hangouts, and suffice it to say, Hangouts does not work quite as well as Zoom for making slides, so kind of funny. So hopefully this one works this time. So I'm going to talk about my book today, and I'm also going to talk about two big reports that I published in the last 2 weeks on clean energy, sort of where we are in the clean energy transition in the United States. So the challenge really is that we have to build clean energy a lot faster than we have been. So when I was finishing writing my book, what I wanted to do was give the reader a sense of not just what are we doing, but what do we need to do? And I think I felt quite inspired to do this actually by all these public debates around the Green New Deal. What was happening in late 2018 when the IPCC 1.5 degrees report came out was that people were starting to recognize that we have to move so much faster. If we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to cut emissions by about half by 2030. And so before that moment, we were really talking about cleaning up our electricity system by 2050. And this curve gives you a sense of where we are versus where we would be going under that scenario. And the data is up till 2018 in this figure, but if you get the most recent data, we're now at about 40%. So it would cross that line at around 2020 and 40% clean. And so we would be in some sense right on schedule, right? But if we think about this another way, look at that data. Nuclear is a very large flat rectangle sitting at the bottom of that figure. Hydropower is a skinnier flat rectangle sitting there. And then we have renewables growing on the top. And of course, if you're paying attention to the electric power sector, you know that we have a big risk of nuclear plants retiring, and some are already retiring. And you know that there's not a lot of new hydro that can be built. So not only do renewables have to keep pace with that line, they also have to make up for the falling share in nuclear. Now, the figure gets even more dramatic if we say, well, it's not fast enough to clean up our electricity system by 2050. We need to be cleaning it up by 2035. And if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that that has really emerged as the goal for the electric power sector. So what does that look like? It's an even steeper curve. And as you can see here, we're certainly not moving fast enough when it comes to decarbonizing the grid. And of course, as, for example, all your colleagues at Princeton who just published this Net Zero America's Pathways, I think that's what it is, the NZAP report or whatever we're supposed to call it, the wonderful report. As they have shown, not only do we have to decarbonize the existing electricity system, we are going to need so much more clean electricity as we electrify transportation, buildings, and even parts of heavy industry, and depending on other choices in the energy transition. we may need, 2-3 times as much power as we have today. So in a certain sense, we're not aiming for 100% clean electricity as a function of the size of the current grid today. What we're really aiming for is like 150% or 200% or 300%. So that makes the challenge even harder. If you're interested in sharing these ideas with other people, maybe in a class or with your friends, I made a video called the Narwhal Curve, and it's really just 3 minutes long, and it gives this exact idea in a really accessible way. So you can just Google that, and it's with Grist. Okay, so of course there have been efforts throughout the 1990s till present to try to pass clean energy policy at the national level in the United States. What a lot of advocates were trying to do initially was pass a renewable portfolio standard. That is going to be one of the main topics of my presentation today. What is a renewable portfolio standard? It's a policy that was pioneered in the 1990s. There were some even earlier in the 80s, but they weren't called that. And what it is it sets a target and a timetable. So how much how much renewable electricity are we going to have by a certain date? So for example, it could be, we want to have 10% clean power by 2010 if this law was passed in, let's say, 2000. These policies were passed in a majority of states, upwards of 30 states throughout the 1990s. But when there were efforts to pass one at the federal level, advocates consistently failed. The closest we have come to passing a federal renewable portfolio standard is in the Waxman-Markey bill back in 2009. That policy, which you may recall passed the House but not the Senate, included a target of 20% renewable energy power by 2020, with 8% allowed to be met with energy efficiency, meaning the binding target was 12%. Now, looking back at that policy, which I did for the book, although it was not a very ambitious policy, it would have actually driven progress because we have some places in the country like Florida and West Virginia that really have very small segments of their electricity system from renewable energy right now. Of course, the Biden-Harris campaign, very well known, and as well as the administration, when President Biden was signing executive orders 2 weeks ago, they endorsed a 100% goal for clean electricity by 2035. And I think this is going to be one of the signature things that the Biden administration will be working on after we get through the COVID relief bill that's currently being negotiated in Congress. So where did all these ideas come from? They really came from the state level. So as I mentioned, throughout the 90s and 2000s, states were passing these renewable portfolio standards, and they passed in a lot of states, including Republican ones. Another policy was also being passed during this time period called net metering, or sometimes called net energy metering. You can see that this policy also passed. In this case, it was passed in 42 states. Many Republican states acted quite early to pass this policy. What is net energy metering or net metering? It's basically a policy that allows you to put solar on your roof and feed the extra electricity that you're making, that you're not consuming in your own house, onto the grid and be paid the same price that you would buy electricity at for the electricity you're selling back to the grid. So if you're buying electricity for, let's say, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, which is the unit that you're buying electricity in, you would be selling it as well for 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And this policy was passed in the vast majority of states with no controversy throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. If you go back and look at the roll calls for these state legislative votes, you'll often find they were completely unanimous. And yet, starting around 2013, the Edison Electric Institute began to attack these policies because they realized that they would dramatically affect their bottom line. So these policies have since been expanded, particularly the Renewable Portfolio Standard, into something called a Clean Electricity Standard. So what is the difference? A clean electricity standard is a renewable portfolio standard, but the eligible technologies include any zero carbon resource. So notably, something like nuclear power or even carbon capture and sequestration, if that technology is able to mature enough and compete in the electric power sector, they could count under a clean electricity standard. So basically what we're doing is broadening the definition and making sure in particular that our existing nuclear fleet can be supported to stay open as long as is safe, because it really is a key part of our clean energy transformation. So what you can see here is that states across the country have been passing 100% clean electricity policies. The most recent one came in December in Arizona, but there are many other states that have acted. And notably, more than 1 in 3 Americans already live in a place that is targeting 100% clean electricity. That's because in addition to all this state action, more than 170 cities have also passed clean electricity policies. So what my book focuses on is the growing interest group backlash to these clean energy policies. Fossil fuel companies and electric utilities, and I should certainly add now gas utilities, are resisting the clean energy transition. In the last few months, in fact, gas utilities have emerged as probably a worse actor than electric utilities because they really face an existential threat with some of the efforts that advocates have been making in California, city by city, to pass bans on gas, fossil gas for cooking and heating and all that in new buildings. And for those of you who aren't following that, more than 40 cities have passed these bans. And at this point, we actually have efforts to get these policies passed in more states. And unfortunately, Republican states have started to pass policies banning gas bans at the sort of interests of gas utilities. So as this interest group conflict plays out, what my book does is try to document the variety of tactics that interest groups have been using to try to undermine what we would call in political science policy feedback. So what is policy feedback? Typically, when we think about public policy, we think about how politics, like the election of President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, can change the political landscape and make public policy, like a clean electricity standard, more likely. My cat is currently attacking my couch, if you can hear that in the background. Okay, so we think about politics as the independent variable and policy as the dependent variable. Now, what if we instead reverse that causal arrow and we think about how policy itself, something like a clean electricity standard or renewable portfolio standard, can reshape the political landscape and change the politics? Well, that's about policy feedback, because we're thinking about how policy feeds back to change the political landscape and how over time that political landscape could feed back to shift the policy even more, maybe growing it further. In which case we would have a positive feedback loop, right? Because a clean energy policy would reshape the political landscape, bolster new clean energy advocates. Those clean energy advocates would come back and lobby to expand the policy further. And we would have this virtuous cycle. So when these laws were first passed, that's what people thought would happen. They sort of wanted to have a little policy at time one, maybe 20% renewable energy policy, and they figured that they could come back years later and expand it. And that is actually what played out in California, one of the states that I did a lot of work for in this book. But in many other states, that isn't what happened. And why not? Because interest groups fought back against the policy feedback process. And how did they do that? They used lobbying. They resisted laws being implemented in public utility commissions and other state agencies. They used primary challenges and elections to drive polarization in the Republican Party. They used what's called astroturfing or fake grassroots campaigns to make it seem like the public was against clean power, even when they were for clean power. And they used court cases to try to challenge laws' implementation in practice. So this is really what I argue in the book. Now, if you want to see that in a more simple form that's easier to follow, we know that, right, a legislature debates a bill and then they pass it and the bill becomes a law. And in policy feedback studies, what we do is we take that law as the beginning of the process. So what does that law do? Well, it redistributes resources between advocate and opponent interest groups. So suddenly utilities have less resources and new clean energy companies have more. And those utilities start to see themselves be challenged by this new policy. So what do? Well, they fight back in many cases. And they can do that both directly by going to the legislature through things like campaign contributions or lobbying or developing very tight relationships with legislators. But they can also do it indirectly by using the public. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those tactics are by using the public. So there's a concept called astroturfing. What does it mean? It means fake grassroots, right? AstroTurf is that fake plastic grass. So the same idea here is that you make it seem like the public is against clean energy when the public is not. Well, in Kansas, which is one of the cases in my book, and it's also the place where Koch Industries is headquartered, there were advocates, trying to keep a clean energy policy in place. And suddenly these flyers started to pop up and they said, we don't support clean energy. Kansas seniors are already financially stressed. All these higher utility bills aren't helping. We need to get rid of this clean energy policy because it's ruining old people's ability to pay their bills. So this flyer was sent around by something called the Kansas Seniors Alliance, which was a newly founded 501c3, or basically charity group. And there was a journalist who wanted to figure out, well, who is the Kansas Seniors Alliance? There was no website. They weren't like giving talks publicly. Nobody really knew who were these seniors all upset about their electricity bills. So he found the paperwork that was used to register the group, and it had a lawyer's name on it. And he went to the lawyer and he said, hey, do you work for the Kansas Seniors Alliance? And the lawyer said, I don't work for the Kansas Seniors Alliance. I work for Americans for Prosperity. Well, what is Americans for Prosperity? This is sort of the public-facing advocacy group that's allied with Koch Industries. And what they had done is set up this fake group to make it seem like the public was upset about something when they weren't really. And if we hadn't had the journalists asking these questions, these flyers might have been going around, and people might have thought, particularly legislators might have thought, that they were really representing the public when they were not. Here's an even more nefarious example. In New Orleans, a utility called Entergy wanted to build a new gas plant. And in this case, they had to go to the New Orleans City Council to do it. And at the meeting, you can see that all these people showed up wearing these matching orange shirts and having these signs. Now, if you've ever been to a protest or anything like that, you know that signs are usually handmade and they're painted and they're kind of artistic. And look at these signs, right? They look like they're mass produced and they're not very creative or anything like that. That's kind of funny. And all these people got up and they talked about how much they wanted to build this gas plant. So a journalist went up to some of these people and they said, hey, why did you say you wanted to build this new gas plant in New Orleans? And they said, oh, I don't know anything about this gas plant. I'm an out of work actor and I was hired and paid to come here to this meeting today and hold this sign and wear this shirt and give these comments. And I was even paid more if I got a speaking role, because I'm an out of work actor. I got to say lines. I wasn't just sort of an extra. And I was paid to come here. So it turned out that Entergy had paid a public relations firm who had paid $27,000 to hire a bunch of people to show up for this meeting and to pretend like they were the outraged public when they weren't really at all. So these kinds of tactics, which are being used increasingly to resist the clean energy transition, are very anti-democratic. Right now in Santa Barbara, where I live, there have been efforts to ban gas in new buildings, as I mentioned, has been happening throughout California. And in December, I got a text message from a friend of mine in town. She had received a sort of spam text out of nowhere. And it said, the city council wants to ban gas in your house. And if they do that, the grid will be destabilized and it will be a terrible situation. Write to the city council now to tell them you oppose you getting rid of your gas. To be clear, the city council was not voting to ban gas in existing buildings. It was voting to ban gas in new construction, which, as I mentioned, has been done in 40 cities throughout California. But that misinformation campaign, which initially was not signed by any group, then they sent a second text with the same message, but now had a signature. And the signature was Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions. And if you've been following this fight in California, what's happened is that SoCalGas, the gas utility operating in Southern California, where I live, which, by the way, was responsible for a gas leak, the Porter Ranch gas leak, which had a larger greenhouse gas impact than the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It went on for more than 4 months. This company has decided to create a fake public campaign called Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions and to harass city councils and communities that are trying to get off of fossil gas. And when I went to the city council meeting, actually, because I'd written up a public op-ed saying that this was fake information, et cetera, they sent their own representatives from the Californians for Balanced Energy Solutions. They sent people from SoCalGas, and they also sent a union representative who personally attacked me and said that I was not a professor, I was a politician, I didn't know anything about energy, et cetera. So these are the kinds of tactics that we are increasingly seeing used to try to slow down the clean energy transition. So in addition to manipulating the public to try to slow down clean energy progress, these companies are also using political control and particularly polarization to slow down clean energy. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the past, you may have noticed from my data that clean energy was quite bipartisan, right? So looking at this data in the 1990s, a lot of the states that acted first to pass these clean energy policies were Republican controlled. They had Republican governors, often one of the legislatures were Republican. So for example, in Texas in 1999, Governor George W. Bush was the governor and the House was Democratic and the Senate was Republican. So, there were these bipartisan deals made in the 90s to try to make progress on these issues. But if you fast forward to 2005, you cannot find any Republican jurisdiction acting. In fact, the entire Southeast has never passed one of these policies. So why is that? Well, Republicans have been becoming much more polarized as a party. If you follow political science research, when we talk about polarization, it isn't actually just the Republican Party and the Democratic Party pulling away from one another. What it is that the Democratic Party has stayed approximately in the same point, and we call this ideal points. They're estimates of the ideology of the party overall. And what's happened is the Republican Party has pulled away and become an extremist party. And so when we talk about polarization, we're actually talking about asymmetric polarization, where one side is polarizing and the other side is not. So why is the Republican Party polarizing on climate change? This is a very common question. And what I argue, based on evidence in my book, is that they're polarizing because of the fossil fuel industry and electric utilities. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're a Republican in Kansas. Your name is Representative Russ Jennings, and you represent a part of the state, the western part of the state that's more rural, that's poorer, and you're a Republican. And you find that this clean energy policy is bringing all these new resources to your community. It's increasing the tax base, people are being employed, it's so great. Well, you want to keep that clean energy law because it's really great for your community. And so you decide to vote to keep it. Well, the first time the bill was brought forward to repeal Kansas's renewable portfolio standard, there were equal amounts of Republicans, 44, who voted to keep the policy and 44 who voted to get rid of it. Well, a few weeks later, they had the exact same vote. And suddenly, a couple more Republicans said, you know what, let's get rid of that policy. Then they held the same vote on the same bill a couple weeks after that. And a few more Republicans said, well, I don't really want to support that. Let's get rid of the clean energy policy. So this we would call a panel study, right? A longitudinal study, because we're seeing the same people voting on the same thing over time. Now, the question is, what is the treatment? What is intervening between these votes to change some of these Republican representatives' votes? Well, it turns out that we know, because another representative named Scott Schwab accidentally leaked to the media that he was being leaned on and getting pressure from Koch Industries and Americans for Prosperity lobbyists to change his votes. And they were saying, if you don't change your vote, we're going to pull money from your campaign, and you may find yourself with a well-funded primary challenger. And that threat was actually materialized in the case of Russ Jennings. So Russ Jennings did not change his vote, and he did find himself with a well-funded primary challenger. Now, in this case, the wind energy community actually backed up Russ Jennings, and because it had grown so much in the state, they were able to fund their own political action committee, and he won re-election. But even that creates a chilling effect for the rest of the Republican Party, because you don't want to almost lose re-election if you're a politician. This is your job, right? And so what happens is that it sends a signal to everybody else that you better get on the right side of this issue. And why does it matter if one company is mad at you about one vote? Well, let's think about how you get funding in Kansas. Your number one source of resources is the Kansas Republican Party. What is a top donor to the Kansas Republican Party? Koch Industries. Your second main source is the Kansas Chamber of Commerce. What's a top donor to the Kansas Chamber of Commerce? Koch Industries. Your third top donor is Koch Industries. So if one company has this much influence in the state and they decide that they're really mad about this issue, it can create a really big chilling effect, and people can lose all their funding and they can have well-funded primary challengers. For those of you who remember Representative Bob Inglis in Congress, who was a Republican who during his service when he was elected, he realized that he believed in climate change. And he tells the story of why that was. He went on a few scientific research studies, I think to Antarctica. His son, who was younger, said, "Dad, climate change is real. I'm really worried for my generation," and he decided that he believed in climate change. Well, what happened to Bob Inglis? He found himself with a well-funded primary challenger and he lost. So this can send a real chilling effect and lead to polarization across the party. And when the elites polarize, oops, I talked too long. Let me go back. When the elites polarize, what happens is that the public polarizes too. We know from political science work from people like Gabe Lenz, a political science professor at UC Berkeley, that the mass public follows elites, right? So if I'm a Republican, it's not like I know everything about clean energy and renewables, right? I don't really know. And so the way that I figure out what I should think is I listen to people like me. So if I'm a Republican and Donald Trump is out there saying that, oh, wind turbines cause cancer and they will mess up my television and, climate change is a hoax and whatever else, then I'm going to think, well, this stuff isn't important and I don't believe in it, right? And so that's what starts to happen around 2009 when these companies start to kick up massive campaigns nationally against clean energy. That starts to trickle down into the public as well. Okay, so if you're interested in my book, I talk about a lot of different cases from Texas, Kansas, Arizona, and Ohio. I've also written up some of these cases elsewhere. So if you want to learn about what happened in Ohio, which was a $60 million bribery scheme, I've written up a part of that for Vox. And the Arizona case, which is, again, a very fascinating corruption story, I did actually a podcast for my podcast called A Matter of Degrees, and it's called The Darth Vader of Electric Utilities. And you can learn about what happened in Arizona there. I'll just have a final thought on my book before I move on, which is that a lot of people know that fossil fuel companies were really involved in promoting climate denial and climate delay. But what a lot of people don't know is that electric utilities were also very involved in this. So in the third chapter of my book, I describe how these utilities promoted a very wasteful energy system that caused more fossil fuels to be burned than otherwise would have needed to be burned, that they promoted climate denial. They were very involved in the Global Climate Coalition, one of the key climate denial groups in the 1990s. And of course, I document throughout the book how they've been trying to roll back clean energy laws. There are, of course, variations in electric utilities. Some are not as bad as others by any means, but I think we have to be honest in a kind of like truth and reconciliation way about what the industry has been doing to delay progress and what the consequences of their actions have been for climate change. And you can read a summary of this book if you don't have a copy on Drilled News. A summary of this part of the book. So if you'd like to get a copy, you can go to the Oxford University Press website. It's bit.ly/scp-book. And there's a discount code that anybody can use. Feel free to take a look, take a screenshot of that or just copy down that code. There's also a Kindle ebook available. You can go to bit.ly/scp-kindle to get a book. And there is also an audiobook. And I am a big fan of audiobooks myself. I'm currently doing Obama's audiobook, very interesting. And so if you like audiobooks, it's another way to listen to it as well. Okay. So now for the last couple minutes of my talk here, I'm going to talk about two reports that I've released in the last 2 weeks, one with the Sierra Club and another one with Evergreen and Data for Progress. Okay, so let's talk first about the Sierra Club report. This report, which is called The Dirty Truth About Utility Climate Pledges, is a report that looks at all these pledges that utilities have been making over the past few years, claiming that they want to clean up their electricity system by 2050 or 2030 or whatever it is. And what we did was we looked at those pledges and we compared them to what they're doing in practice, right? We looked at where the money is actually going. And what we saw was a huge gap between the sort of words on paper when it comes to pledges and the practical implementation of those goals. And in part, this is because a lot of the parent companies, so in the utility space, we often have parent companies, like, for example, Southern Company, which owns and operates several other utilities that are actually the ones that are supplying power in a given space, like Georgia Power, Alabama Power, Mississippi Power, right? So what happens is that Southern Company sets a goal, we're going to be net zero by 2050. But then When Georgia Power goes to make decisions about whether or not it's going to build a gas plant or what it's going to be doing in a given state, what they do is they go to their Public Utility Commission or Public Service Commission and they say, here's what we plan to do. And when the commissioners ask, well, how is this in line with your corporate target? They say, oh, well, that's the Southern Company target. That doesn't apply to us. So even though they're the operating company of the parent company that has the goal, they are not actually applying that goal in practice. And this happens a lot. So these goals become rather meaningless because they're not used in operations and planning. So without a federal clean electricity standard, remember that's that policy I've been talking about that says we're going to have 100% clean power by 2035. Most utilities are not going to move fast enough. And this is really the takeaway from the Sierra Club report. So we do have a range in the speed that different utilities are doing. And what we did was we graded all the utilities. Well, we graded the 50 biggest utilities that have the most fossil fuels today. Okay, so we looked at the kind of top 50 big fossil fuel users. This is coal and gas. And what we said was, you know, what are your plans to retire your coal plants? What are your plans to stop building new gas plants? And what are your plans to build new clean power? Because if we want to decarbonize our electricity system, what do we have to do? We have to shut down coal, we have to stop building new gas, and we have to build an enormous amount of clean power. And based on those three metrics, we gave everybody a grade from 100 to 0. And unfortunately, a lot of the utilities scored quite low, as you can see here. So we did a bit of a grading curve, just like if you gave somebody too hard of a test, and we gave half of the utilities an F, and then we gave the other utilities sort of like Ds and Cs and Bs and As. So this is a very interesting little case study here because these are the utilities that we graded in Indiana. And what you can see is that even within one state, there is so much variation in what utilities are doing. We have some like NIPSCO, which are right at the top of the pack. NIPSCO has made pledges to retire all its coal, to stop building gas, and to build a lot of clean power. So it's doing a great job, and it gets the second highest score of any utility in the country. And then we have a lot of other utilities that are doing kind of a blend. And we come down to Duke, and Duke, as a parent company, we look at all their subsidiaries, and across the board, their subsidiaries are not planning to retire many coal plants in the coming decade, and they are planning to build massive amounts of gas. And so overall, they do very poorly. So what is the big takeaway here? If we look at these utilities, these are, remember, the 50 biggest utilities for coal and gas generation, and we look at their generation in 2019, you can see that they did, let's say, about 1,300 million megawatts of fossil generation, okay? Now, what are they planning? What are they going to build in the next decade according to their own plans on clean energy? They're only going to build a fifth of that in clean power. So this is not fast enough. This is not a plan to decarbonize the electricity system at the pace and scale that is necessary. When it comes to coal retirements, you can see that our grading scheme is very fair because we have many utilities at the bottom of this list here that are getting Fs that are operating huge amounts of coal. And what you can see is that they basically have no plans to retire them. And that is a problem because if we want to clean up our electricity system, we have to get off coal. And of course, getting off coal is not just important when it comes to climate stability, it's also really important for public health, and particularly for communities of color, because we have stuck so much of our dirty fossil generation in the backyards of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans. So if you'd like to dig into this data yourself, we actually have, in addition to the report, which you can just download, it's a PDF, there's also a really cool dashboard that my report co-authors at the Sierra Club pioneered. And what you can do is you can select any utility in the country that we look at. Remember, this is the top 50. So my utility's not in there because they're doing a lot better. That's Southern California Edison. But maybe your utility is in there. And you can use the drop down and you can look up how they're doing and you can see what is their plan to build new clean energy? What is their plan to retire gas? And just to be clear, all this data was really hard to compile because it's all over the place, right? It's in these corporate utility pledge documents. It's in IRP documents at public utility commissions. And so what we did is we collected all this data for a lot of different companies and made it accessible to everybody in a clear one-stop shopping kind of way. So I just encourage people to check this out. Okay, So turning to my other report, we have a really big opportunity this year to scale up all these state and local actions that I've been talking about in the beginning of my talk today into federal policy. And in particular, we have an opportunity for a 100% clean electricity standard this year. Of course, there's also efforts to do auto standards, energy efficiency, and home retrofits and things like that. But the 100% clean electricity standard by 2035 is a huge, huge opportunity. Why is that? Well, directly, the electricity sector contributes about a quarter of our greenhouse gases. It's the second biggest sector behind transportation. But what happens when we have clean electricity? Well, we can use that clean power, as I've talked about, to electrify a lot of our transportation sector through things like electric vehicles. We can use it to power our homes through things like induction stoves and electric heat pumps. And we can maybe even clean up about half of heavy industry. And when we add up all those different slices of our carbon budget in the United States, our carbon footprint, what we find out is that clean electricity powering a lot of our economy can decarbonize between 70 to 80% of our climate problem, right? So it's easy to think that, climate change is a really complex problem, and it totally is, but clean electricity becomes a really key catalyst that can allow huge parts of our economy to decarbonize. So that's why it's so important to get this right. Now, Biden and Harris also ran on $2 trillion of investments for climate change over their 4 years. And so I think what's going to happen is that the next big reconciliation package in the spring will be a big investment package on clean energy and climate change and job creation. And they also said that those investments need to center racial justice, as well as make sure that fossil fuel economies are not left behind, so that 40% of investments will go to disadvantaged communities. And that can be, for example, job creation in parts of Appalachia that, have historically hosted coal extraction. They can be, clean energy investments in Black backyards where we've been putting dirty fossil fuel infrastructure for decades. So we can really think about making sure that everybody can benefit from the clean energy transition. Now, can we clean up our electricity system fast and by 2035? The answer is yes. There was last summer a landmark report, 2035report.com, that shows how we can do this. And I really encourage people to download that report and check it out. It shows that we can get to 90% clean by 2035 and actually save customers money, because clean power is cheaper than many of these old coal plants that companies continue to operate because it's in their financial interest, even though it's not in the financial interest of their customers. So I published this report last week with Evergreen and Data for Progress, which shows how we can get this Biden-Harris vision into law. So why should Congress pass this clean electricity standard? Well, we've got a really critical opportunity before us here, right? We have the Senate and the House being democratically controlled, and we have a reconciliation bill that will pass in the spring that can focus on these issues. And Congress can and must act on a clean electricity standard. We've seen so much progress at the state and local level. Like I said, more than 1 in 3 Americans already live in a place targeting 100% clean power. So this is not a new idea. We know how it works. We know how to scale it up. It's also a really popular idea, and I'll show you some polling from Data for Progress on that. And it's a very practical approach where we can ensure that we're creating jobs across this country, ensuring justice, and also making sure that we're not jacking up electricity bills so that, this maintains its popularity over time. So can we do this through budget reconciliation? Well, since last May, I've been working on this project to try to answer that question. And so for this report, we interviewed dozens of people working in Congress or NGOs or think tanks. And we asked them, how could we go about doing this? What do you think is important for decarbonizing the grid? And we came up with 3 big options for how to do it and 3 alternative approaches that really approximate a CES. But the big idea is that basically the federal government can pay through grants for building clean power at the pace and scale that's necessary. And they can buy those attributes of clean power, which we would call a zero emissions or zero electricity credit, a ZEC. And that can provide a little bit of extra resources to utilities and independent power producers to help them move at the pace and scale that's necessary. And if they don't move fast enough, we can give them an alternative compliance payment, basically a penalty for not moving fast enough. And why does that fit into a budget and the budget reconciliation process? Because it's about expenditures, putting money out the door to get stuff built quickly, and fees, getting revenues into the federal government if people are not moving fast enough. So this really fits in with the existing structure. And in many ways, it's a little bit like a production tax credit, except that rather than using the tax credit system, it'll be more like a grant, which has some benefits. Now, in addition to doing these clean electricity standard, there's a lot of other things that we need to be doing as part of this comprehensive climate bill that is coming. And we talk about a lot of them in the report if people are interested. I'll just say this is a very popular approach. Data for Progress did polling both in January as well as right before the election, where they asked people how they thought about this idea. And they found that it was really popular, including along partisan lines, and including in key swing states. So I don't have that figure here today, but states that were really close for the election, places like Arizona, this is a very popular idea. I'll also say that we have some examples of corporate leadership already moving us in this direction. In September, Google made a really landmark pledge that they would do 100% clean electricity by 2030, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in real time. Keep in mind that Google is perhaps the largest electricity user in the country, okay? So they are not a small fish, so to speak. And if they think that they can be supplying clean electricity to all their facilities all across this country in real time, by 2030, that would be very transformative to the overall decarbonization pathway for the country. We are also seeing utilities starting to lead on this issue. In Colorado, essentially all the utilities are committed to 80% clean power by 2030, which is directly on the pathway to 100% clean by 2035. And we got an endorsement for our report from the current governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, because he has really been leading to help broker these deals with utilities in Colorado. So I'm hopeful, more hopeful than I've ever been, that the utility industry is finally ready to come to the table and negotiate for a federal clean electricity standard. In addition to all this other work I do a lot of climate advocacy. If you're interested in checking out my podcast, it's called A Matter of Degrees. We talk about a lot of different things. And I'm also in this book called All We Can Save, which is a collection of women writing on climate change. And it's a really nice essay collection. So thanks very much. Great to be here with all of you today. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Okay, thank you, Leah. You have my applause, even if you can't hear the rest of them. I want to invite people to pose questions by either putting a question in writing in the Q&A box, and then we'll call on you to speak it out yourself, and or raising your hand using the raised hands function. And while people are deciding what to do, let me just ask you a quick question to lead off. You pointed out that a lot of firms had taken positions against clean energy, either publicly or in a subterranean way. But firms calibrate their interest, and when a new administration comes in, you'll probably see them saying things, at least in public, which have a different tone. You know, the GM announcement on electric cars, for instance, may be real. There may be real substance there, but we'll see, is my view on that. So is there any signals yet, or is it too early? Do you see firms reacting to this? Are they recalibrating and repositioning? What's going on out there? And also, there I think have been some changes at Koch Industries in terms of their funding political activities. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I do think that we are in a huge moment for climate action, and that the January 5th election was absolutely transformative for what we can think is possible this year. It's so exciting. As I mentioned, last year, there was not a budget reconciliation process used for the fiscal year 20 process. And that means that they're using that to do the COVID bill, which you're probably following, all these stimulus check debates, et cetera. Interestingly, there is $5 billion in that proposed package for electricity bill relief for people. And that's really important because during the pandemic, a lot of people are really behind on paying their electricity bills because they're facing shutoffs potentially. They haven't been able to pay their bills. It's a big problem. And so that's going to be an important thing in the COVID relief bill. And I think it's also an important thing when we think about our solutions to climate change, that we don't just think, let's raise electricity bills for people, because so many people are already struggling to pay their bills. So then the second process that we will see after this thing called impeachment, which I hear is starting today. It will be another budget resolution process, and that will start to play out, we believe, in the spring, and that will be focused on clean energy, climate action, really what Biden ran on, which is his Build Back Better agenda. So people should definitely tune into that. And I do think that many companies are starting to read the tea leaves, so to speak, not just in the election, but in what consumers are looking for and where the global economy is moving, right? When you're a car manufacturer, you have to think about, well, what kinds of cars are people going to want to be buying in a few years? And that's not just in the United States, it can be in Europe or in China. And I think there have been signals coming out of other countries putting pressure on companies like GM to start changing their plans for manufacturing. And I own an electric vehicle. It's awesome for what that's worth. You know, these are actually better technologies. We're not asking people to make sacrifices. We're actually giving people better options. And so it's not just the leadership of countries around the world. It's also sort of pressure from the public to start making these different vehicles. Where electric utilities are concerned, as I mentioned, I am more hopeful than I have ever been. I really think that electric utilities see the demand from the public, from states, from the federal government to start acting, and that if they could just get their heads on straight, they would realize this is the largest opportunity for their industry in over a century, that the amount of capacity expansion that they can do, right? Think about all the new stuff we're going to ask them to build. And how do these companies make money? They build stuff and then they make profits based off their building of stuff. So if they want to build an electricity system that's twice as big as it is today so that we can electrify buildings and transportation, they can make a lot of money on that. And if we can just figure out ways to get those uneconomic coal plants off their balance sheets, which I think is something that more and more of these companies actually want to do, then, you know, they can start to be these engines of the clean energy future. So it's funny, the CEO of NextEra last week made a public statement saying there is not a single economic coal plant left in this country, full stop, period. That was what he said. So these companies have to figure out what their plan is, and their plan just can't be to continue to delay and pretend like they're running these great coal plants. These coal plants really suck economically. So I think that there's a lot of reasons that the utility industry is willing to come to the table and negotiate, and that we should see some big progress this year. So why am I so hopeful about that? Because if we could get the utility industry on the side of climate action, then we would have a Goliath to take on the other Goliath, which is the fossil fuel industry. And the fundamental thing is that the fossil fuel industry is going to have a much harder time pivoting than the utility industry. So I think that the dynamics are really starting to shift.
Good. Let's go. I'm going to try to alternate between the raised hands and the Q&A box. So Bob Cohen next.
Bob, you'll have to know that before you came here, we were laughing that we knew you would ask a question. So you're very predictable.
Of course, given that it's you, of course I'd be here to ask a question. I have a double question, and there are two things we haven't talked about much. One is investors, and one is unions and union jobs. On the investors, it seems to me, and it seems to BlackRock, I think now, that no rational executive would build a new fossil fuel plant. And no rational executive would build a new plant to build internal combustion engines. You do those things, you get fired by investors. So can you comment on that? That seems to me a great opportunity, because even if we have irrational executives, we don't have irrational investors. And secondly, on the job side, Gina McCarthy said in her press conference a week or two ago that the jobs will be where the workers are. What's the trade-off between meeting a goal for jobs, a total goal for jobs, and making sure that those jobs are targeted for the places where the workers are now? Is that a steep trade-off, or is it a shallow trade-off?
Yeah, those are great questions. So on the investor question first, I really think things are shifting, because I'll tell you, my inbox is full of investors asking me to come and talk to them, which I'm like, okay, here goes my time. Let's just say that there are many investment firms, banks, who want to know, what's the plan here? What are we doing? And they're really starting to, I think, recognize the risks. You know, Emily Gruber, a professor at Georgia Tech, has been doing really great research. She had a recent paper in Science where she looks at, let's say we're going to get to 100% clean electricity by 2035. How many stranded assets do we have? You know, stranded costs, as we call it in the electric utility sector. Basically, things that we invested in that we can't really pay off because we're going to retire them too soon. And what she found is that if we stop building new fossil stuff today, it's not that bad. The transition isn't like, very manageable. But if you keep building new fossil gas plants today, you are going to create stranded costs. And I think that companies have to start reckoning with that these are bad decisions, much like when they were faced with the mercury rule and they had to decide if they wanted to shut down their coal plants or retrofit them so that they can continue to operate. They made a lot of bad decisions in that moment, right? They said, let's retrofit these old, 40, 60-year-old plants that we had mostly paid off. Let's dump a crap ton of new debt in them. And those were bad decisions. Now, we're going to have a little bit of a moral hazard here, probably, because we're going to help these companies deal with their terrible decisions, probably. But we need to make sure that they don't keep making terrible decisions with these gas plants. And I am hopeful that the investor community can be a key lever to put pressure on these companies, the utility sector. In terms of the union job question and where are the jobs going to be, I think that the policy can be designed to create benefits for fossil fuel communities and other communities in transition. We are going to work on modeling up that Evergreen and Data for Progress report. And the modeler we're working with wrote me an email yesterday saying 70% of these jobs will be in red and purple states. So, we're going to have a lot of jobs going into fossil fuel areas. And one thing that I found so hopeful about the Net Zero America's Pathways report from Princeton was that looking at the high resolution maps that they made of where all the wind and solar was going. I mean, my gosh, there's so much going into West Virginia, for example. So I think that the thing is that we don't have to think about scarcity here. There is so much work to be done. If we just take this seriously, if we're like, this is a moonshot, this is a, thing we got to push on. Everybody who wants a job can get a job in the clean energy transition because we have so much work to do and so little time to do it. And the nice thing about moving away from the tax credit approach that we've had for so long towards more like a grants approach, which is what we're advocating, is that it's much more accessible to more actors in society who don't have as much tax liability, and you can more easily put union and labor requirements on it because it's not a tax credit, and it's very hard to enforce those standards through the tax code. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity here to not just make sure that we're creating millions of jobs, but that we're creating millions of good paying jobs. Now, there is a trade-off there, but the trade-off there is cost, right? Because the more it costs to do the transition, which is worker costs to some extent, the more expensive the transition is. But ultimately, we are having huge income inequality in this country. We have a real hollowed out middle class. And so we do have to invest in union jobs and make sure that, we are paying people a good wage to do this work.
Okay, so we have we had a very big audience today, and we have a lot of questions. We're not going to
go shorter. No double questions allowed.
Yeah, and also at the end of the day, can I suggest maybe that people should email you with some of these questions because they're great questions, but they're not going to get answered today.
Okay.
I'm doing a little sorting here. Vanessa Varheit, are you still there? Because I'd like you to call out your question directly to Leah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Hi, Leah. My question is about work that I'm doing currently in California on building code standards, because I'm actually reading your book right now, and I kept scribbling in the margins like, yes, but this isn't a legislative process. This is a sort of backroom baseball code making process. And so I'm just curious if you can talk about that. And specifically, I'm working on electric vehicle infrastructure in new construction, but the same fight is happening in parallel with the gas ban issue, but in the building codes to get for those 40 cities reach codes actually embedded in the state code so that it applies across the board to poor and rural districts as well as the wealthier ones on the coast. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about the process there and if you've got any advice, because because I know this is going to happen all over the country. It's like you've got the legislature making some decisions, but at the end of the day, you've really got these backroom bureaucrats making a lot of decisions, and the lobbyists, specifically, right, in our case from the building industry, lean on them, have just inordinate influence.
Yeah. So my book actually does take up very explicitly the implementation process, in my case at public utility commissions, as a key part of this process. And if you look at the model that is in chapter 2, you'll notice that the lobbying from interest groups is not just happening to the legislature, it's also happening directly to implementing agencies like the California Energy Commission or the California Public Utility Commissions or whatever the Public Utility Commission is in a given state. So I do think that bureaucracies are really key places where these battles are playing out. And one thing that interest groups can do is we can get like legislative direction down to a bureaucracy, an implementing agency, but then they can try to resist that implementation. And I call that implementation resistance. And so what's really important is to have advocates showing up with resources in these lower salience fights, whether that's at the California Energy Commission or the CPUC, to make sure that the views of the public and these environmental groups are represented. And I know that's really hard work and that you're often outgunned. And so one of the things that I argue in this book is that this is why the intervener compensation program that exists at the Public Utility Commission in California is so critical, because it provides resources for advocates to be intervening in the process. Because for these companies that have money on the line, like gas companies, they have so much resources to spend on these fights, and we're often quite imbalanced in these fights. So I do think that this is really critical work that you're doing, and I support you fully in it. And I know there's been a lot of controversy about the CEC not wanting to update their code this year on a lot of these building electrification challenges. So, make sure that you try to get these issues to be public. There are journalists you can reach out to try to amplify your work. I think Sammy Roth at the LA Times has been doing excellent reporting on these issues. And I know a bunch of advocates have been trying to plug into him to sort of amplify this work. But it's not easy, but I still think a lot of the tactics in the book are relevant, like expanding the scope of conflict to include the public by using the press, for example, trying to put pressure on bureaucrats, trying to raise this visibility of the fight. So best of luck to your work, and hope you find the book helpful overall.
Thanks for that. Before I go to the next question, Keely, can we leave the mic open after and just let everybody go and let people hang around and ask questions with Leah, assuming she has a little more time?
We can leave it so that people who raise their hands can stick around. Yep.
Okay. Do you have a few extra minutes after we're done?
Yeah, I can do like another 10 to 15. Yep.
Okay. So this is going to be the last question from the group. Alice Tianbo Zhang, are you still there? Alice? Yes, she's still there. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Leah. Great talk. Thank you so much. I'm just wondering about whether these interest groups operate differently in swing states compared to solidly red versus blue states, and if so, how they operate differently. Because I know you have some great work on winds and interest groups lobbying there, and how that would affect the electoral fortunes of incumbents. So I just wonder if that has an impact here as well.
Yeah, so the cases that I really look at in my book are more Republican or swing states. And that's because I really wanted to look at the limitations of policy feedback. I had been doing an enormous amount of work on California, which is a pretty solidly blue state, although we did have Governor Schwarzenegger for a certain period, although he was quite pro clean energy. In a state like California, where you don't have a lot of contestation and it's harder to threaten Republicans, for example, that's a place where policy feedback has really taken hold. And you can see that the state is targeting 100% clean power. And for example, in the fights over net metering, which is something I studied in detail, the companies that were established in California that created these rooftop solar models, they were extremely influential in the governor's office, for example, in blocking the rollback of that policy. So in sort of very democratically controlled states, I think that the policy feedback process plays out as predicted. But the point is that we really have to decarbonize the whole country, right? We have to have all the states acting. And so when we have this boom and bust in other places, it can be really consequential in terms of the pace and of decarbonization that's necessary. And then, of course, in just purely Republican controlled states like the Southeast, we never have passed a renewable portfolio standard or clean electricity standard. There is not a single one that exists there. And we have a lot of utilities operating like Duke and Southern Company that are really quite terrible and at the bottom of the list when it comes to clean power. So This is why the federal opportunity this year is so critical, because we have to scale up our action across the entire country.
Okay, well, that's the end of the official time that we have. Let's give Leah another round of applause. And then, and as I said, anyone who wants to hang around and ask Leah questions, you're free to do so. She has about 10, 15 minutes, as you heard. I don't know how far she'll get, but thanks a lot for joining us, and we hope to have you back someday soon.